when you're in a political conflict with someone, and maybe it's an even imagined political conflict with some enemy or some other, I think it's human psychological tendency to really emphasize the differences and really emphasize the otherness, because especially in the last 2 to 3 decades of our involvement in the Middle East, which happens to be where many Muslim majority countries are located, that certain elements in our society have really gone out of the way to emphasize Islam's differences, Islam as a foreign entity, Islam as a strange entity, Islam as uncivilized and barbaric, and as something completely oppositional to the humanistic values and the values of Western civilization.
The word Islam paints an immediate picture in one's mind, but is that picture accurate? Are Muslims and Christians really polar opposites, or is there any common ground to be found? Today's guest, Mairaj Syed, is an expert in Islamic studies and how it relates to Western culture. He's here to walk us through it all. Stay tuned. Islam is a fairly divisive concept. It's a fairly divisive word. It's kind of become associated with this concept of enemy. And it's been done so. We can cover how that's happened over the years later during the conversation. But what might surprise a lot of people is that Western culture and Islam share a lot of values. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that when we talk about Islam, let's talk about the word Islam and what it originally means, its root meaning. And the root meaning is something that I think other adherents to the other monotheistic traditions, Judaism and Christianity, are going to align with, which is, submitting and surrendering to God's will. That's what a Muslim is. A Muslim is someone who willingly and voluntarily chooses to submit to God's will and acknowledges God's existence and acknowledges God's dominion. So I think that from that very simple concept should be very relatable to a lot of Christians and a lot of Jews who, form the basis of Western civilization, at least the religious basis of Western civilization. And implicit in that is, just like Judaism and Christianity, the core concept of the divinity is a monotheistic divinity, a singular divinity. And I think that a lot of people in the United States and the Western world more broadly are going to relate to the idea that, just as there's a sacred scripture, the Torah for Jews, and the Bible, both the Old Testament and New Testament from a Christian perspective, those are, the authoritative words of God. Similarly, Islam, accepts the authoritative status of actually the Bible, both the Torah and the New Testament, but adds an additional scripture, the Quran, which was revealed to Muhammad, the 7th century prophet in Arabia. And that brings us to another kind of very similar, another similarity, which is that Muslims accept the concept of prophecy, which is this singular monotheistic divinity intervenes in human history and communicates to human communities through the medium of chosen special human beings who are prophets that bear the burden of communicating his messages to the people that they are sent to. So I think a lot of people find it surprising, but it is a core aspect of Islamic belief, all Islamic sects, regardless of their diversity, that, for instance, Adam was a prophet, Noah was a prophet, Abraham was a prophet, Jesus was a prophet, and Muhammad is similarly a prophet. So, for instance, when you open up the Quran, these are revelations sent to Muhammad, you will find stories of Noah and Abraham and Jesus and Moses and even the Virgin Mary. And I think a lot of Jews and Christians, do not realize that. So taking a step back, so that's like from a purely religious perspective. I think you take a step back and you look at the larger culture and civilization that Islam was really a huge part of. what you also find are values that I think are going to resonate with Westerners. Values such as equality, specifically equality before God. That God created Adam and all other human beings descended from Adam, and that there is really no principle of discrimination between them. That the only thing that matters is how good of a person you are, what's your moral character, and theological beliefs as well. And then I would say that the last, point of convergence between Western civilization and Islamic civilization is, the idea of democracy in a broad sense. And what I mean by that is, and here I think that Islam is a little bit different from Catholic forms of Christianity and more similar to Protestant forms of Christianity and Judaism, in the sense that there is no, when we talk about religious authority, like who can interpret God's scriptures in an authoritative way, or who can represent God's will, the solution that Muslims came up with was really not the solution like having a pope or having a bureaucracy of bishops. Rather, they're like, you know what? God's explicit will is found only in texts. And there are certain human beings who, through training and experience, learn a lot about those texts and how to interpret them. But not any one single one of them has the definitive authoritative solution. And those are the religious scholars. So authority is extremely decentralized in Islam. And that's part of the reason why you have a lot of disagreement on many matters of religious law amongst Muslims. You have a considerable amount of agreement on theological matters. So you have, a kind of a almost a democratic system of religious interpretation and religious authority in Islam. So all of those values, the belief in some kind of a transcendent divinity, which is singular, the belief in certain books as sacred and authoritative, therefore as scripture, in God's sending of prophets throughout the long history of human communities, the idea of equality before God, and the idea that no abstract corporate institution can represent God on earth, that God's will is discovered through the interpretation of sacred texts, and that if you are an expert, regardless of what class, through training and through learning, then you get to represent your interpretation as authoritative, and it's really up to people whether or not they want to follow you or not. So I think those are, certain broad areas of alignment and agreement between Islam and the other religious traditions that are extremely influential in the West. And I also think that, even the secular Western civilization, the idea of equality, the idea of democracy also has resonances in Islamic civilization.
That's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to unpack right there, and I want to try to unpack it all, because everything you just laid out there. First of all, I had never considered that the Quran is actually like an apocryphal writing of what we consider like the Bible. It's basically 2.0, or it would be like another scripture, another variant of scripture that just hasn't been folded into the main body. I'm going through my mind and I'm thinking about origin stories and things like that are all represented in the Quran, and they go through like eschatology, like the prophecies that will unfold the end of the earth. Does the Quran involve any of those things?
So origin stories, like the story of Adam as the first human being created by God, that story is found in the Quran, just like it's found in Genesis in the Bible. And as like the point at which, human responsibility and acknowledgement of God's sovereignty, that's there in the Quran, just like it's there in the Bible. And then when it comes to like eschatology, end of times, the Quran talks at length about how there is going to be a final day that human beings are going to be resurrected and held accountable for their individual actions after they die. And they will be requited. Whatever good that they do, they're going to be rewarded for it. And whatever bad that they do, they're going to be punished for it. That is a core part of the eschatology of the Quran. Now, when it comes to more detailed pictures of like the end of times and even the return of Jesus Christ as a Messiah, I think that many non-Muslim Westerners are going to be surprised to hear that actually Islam also has that doctrine, that at the end of times, Jesus is going to return as a Messiah, and he is going to restore the world, which at that point in time will be full of inequity and tyranny, and to justice, and he's going to be divinely aided in that respect. So Jesus, for Muslims, has this important end of times redemptive role in the divine drama of human existence. Now, those stories aren't found in the Quran specifically. They're found in a secondary scripture called the hadith. But I think many people are going to find it surprising that there's that level of alignment and congruence between Islam and Christianity, at least in this respect.
Yeah, almost like, to my mind, the perception was these are two separate things that share similarities, like similar, whatever, caveats within. But you're saying this is a Venn diagram. There's like these things overlap each other. It's not just coincidence. This is actually, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about the same structure.
Yeah, I think that there is, when you're in a political conflict with someone, and maybe it's an even imagined political conflict with some enemy or some other, I think it's human psychological tendency to really emphasize the differences and really emphasize the otherness. And I think that because, especially in the last 2 to 3 decades of our involvement in the Middle East, which happens to be where many Muslim majority countries are located, militarily, our conflict with them, that certain elements in our society have really gone out of the way to emphasize Islam's differences, Islam as a foreign entity, Islam as a strange entity, Islam as uncivilized and barbaric, and as something completely oppositional to the humanistic values and the values of Western civilization. But if you just look at it, take a step back, and look at the general structure of religious ideas and Islamic civilization, I think people will be surprised to find the amount of similarity and kind of what you said, a substantial amount of overlap. It's like I like the way that you put it, a Venn diagram overlap between Christianity and Islam, between the trajectory of Western values and Islamic values as well.
And I think if I had to observe just from that, the key differences, I think there are fewer, like the how would I say this? The governance, that component that goes along with religions. I recently spoke with a Presbyterian minister, and I was surprised to know that there is no single body that dictates. Like it's very much like Islam, like you said. This is we get together, we discuss best practices, but there's no one interpreter. There's no one infallible. Forgive me, Catholics. There's no one pope that just says, this is how we see it. This is how we interpret it. This is how you act, or whatever. So I think there, even structurally, from a governance component, there are more similarities than certainly I knew. So that's really revealing. I do want to lock into, so I think there's a lot of red meat to be had in where these differences are highlighted. And it seems to me to be deliberate highlighting of the differences, almost like one of the for instance is hijabs. Western culture looks at that and says, I don't get that at all. But can you explain a little bit about the history of that? So
let me before I get to the hijab, let's talk about place of women in Islam in general, because this is a point of a lot of attention and focus when it comes to Islam-Western relations. So, some interesting facts. Theologically, women and men are both considered equal before the sight of God. They're both going to be rewarded for their good deeds and bad deeds on the day of judgment after they're resurrected. There's no special privilege that men have over women or women have over men. So theologically, they're spiritually equal. I think that people will also be surprised to know that from its very beginning, Islamic law, or Sharia, I know it's kind of a boogeyman term these days, but the Sharia held that women can hold property in their own name, that they can inherit property in their own name, not in the name of their fathers or their husbands or their sons or some other male figure. They can leave property. And interestingly, in Islamic history, like there was this one really important study done by a historian of Egypt in UCLA. And she went and she looked at people who created, in medieval Cairo, who created these charitable trusts or endowments to support universities, to support public works. And she found that, a significant fraction of them, maybe, I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, 30 to 40% of all endowments created in medieval Egyptian society were created by women. So that gives you a sense of the amount of economic power that they have, because in order to create an endowment, you had to have a lot of access to capital, and you had to, be able to, set aside that capital for what you want it to go to. So this was not just a privilege in the law, this was a privilege that was exercised in history. I want to also talk a little bit about the more contemporary period. So Islam has a reputation for being very patriarchal and very misogynistic. And I do think that some of that is deserved, but I don't think that it is especially patriarchal or misogynistic in a way that differentiates it from all of the other pre-modern religions. Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of them have patriarchal elements to it, and I don't think that Islam is categorically different. But let's talk about the modern age. Modern age in the United States, we have not been able to elect a female president yet. Hopefully one day we will. But most modern Muslim countries, like 4 or 5 of them, have already elected female presidents. Indonesia has elected a female head of state. Bangladesh has elected a female head of state. Turkey has elected a female head of state. Pakistan has elected a female head of state. So there are 2 things in this statement. One is all of these countries have elections. So you would think that they'd all be like some kind of theocratic, tyrannical, authoritarian regimes, which many of them are. They have their problems, or they're monarchies, but that's not the case. There's actually a significant amount of diversity in political forms. But they do have, these countries at least have elections. 2, if these countries were so thoroughly misogynistic, and so they hated women so much, then it would be impossible for them to have elected a woman as a head of state. They could have picked anyone else. And that points to another really interesting fact, that in all these countries, women have the right to vote. So when you start looking much more closely at the reality of the practice of Muslim countries, even as they exist today, what you find is a very different story. So even when it comes to hijab is the covering that women wear if they are very committed practicing women, although there are many committed practicing women that don't wear the hijab as well. But there are 55 Muslim majority countries. Only 2 require, as a matter of state law, that women must cover their hair in public. That's Iran and Saudi Arabia. 53 other Muslim majority countries do not have that as a matter of state law. So if you go to Turkey, you go to Malaysia, you go to Indonesia, you go to Pakistan, what you find are, many women who choose to cover, many women who choose not to cover. And it really kind of comes down to a personal choice that the vast majority of Muslim women make on whether or not they choose to cover or not. So, that is an important point to highlight. And what you do find is there is, I would say that the majority of the religious scholars that are authoritative interpreters of the Quran, the majority of them think that covering your hair is an obligation, that every woman of age should do it. But they also say, simultaneously, that there are dress code requirements for men as well. So the way that they're really imagining when we talk about hijab is that they're really imagining this as like a type of public decency requirement. Like, all right, in America, we have similar public decency requirements. You cannot go outside in the vast majority of places, even in, a place like the West that's supposed to be very free, which I think it is very free, but you're not going to be allowed to go out naked. You have to cover yourself. And I would even go so far as to say that there is a discrimination between what women need to cover and what men need to cover. And so similarly, when you kind of already see that as part of our own culture, you just extend it. And the religious law says, yeah, women need to cover parts that are different than men. Both need to cover different parts. And most of the religious scholars say that it's an obligation for women to cover their hair. There are some more kind of independent-minded religious scholars that say, no, their interpretations of the Quran do not hold that it is a requirement. So there's that level of doctrine. And then when it comes down to practice, like what are Muslim women actually doing, I think there is two levels of differences. One level of difference is there are many women that, follow the, majority position, and they say, yeah, women should cover. And amongst that, some of them do cover, but many of them do not. They're like, maybe I'll have, because it's difficult, maybe, I'll do it next year. My faith is not strong enough. They have an internal monologue about, should I do it? When's the right time? Or many of them think, no, I don't think God wants me to do that. I don't think it's required. And then when you go and you talk to the women, both the ones that cover and you don't cover, and you can very easily do this, just do a search on hijab YouTube testimonials, and you'll find a ton of testimonials of Muslim women talking about their experience of wearing the hijab or their decision not to wear it. And what you find is a range of meanings and symbols that they give to it. Some women say, yeah, I think it's a patriarchal symbol, and I do not wear it because I love the freedom of, having my hair I don't want to obey that. But then there are others that make the exact same argument, but come to an opposite conclusion. They say, no, actually, me covering my hair is a rebellion against the male gaze and against the patriarchy. I'm covering my beauty to resist the male defining standards of beauty. And then there's going to be other meanings as well. I'm doing it because I want to get close to God. I'm doing it because it's the practice of my culture. I'm doing it because it symbolizes my identity as a Muslim to the public. So there is an incredible amount of rich diversity on what the hijab symbolizes to different Muslim women. So, I think that hopefully gives a very, I hope it's succinct, exploration of this topic.
Yeah, it actually does. And it I think by inference, by extension of that simple concept, there's a beauty that exists there in empowering people to interpret as they see fit, which is, there's a liberty built into that I think Western culture has never really considered. That's a value that Islam has that we should really respect. That you're empowered to interpret to your own liking and live your life as you see fit, based on these readings as you read them and when to put them into place. I can't help but look at this. What you're describing is a very beautiful, elegant, all-encompassing, very open and forgiving culture, a set of religious beliefs that is not entirely dissimilar or at all dissimilar to what most Westerners have been brought up in a Christian home, whatever, or who have been brought up in a Christian home would recognize. And I'm looking at this and I'm seeing someone cherry-picked a few facts and attempted to demonize this, because the way Islam has been communicated in my purview, like in all my instances, it has been kind of it's a Stone Age thing. That's like we're so much more advanced or whatever, which is clearly not the case. But like the hijab, for instance, that's something that people would point to and say it's a backward culture kind of a thing, when it's actually not that at all. So I really appreciate you clarifying that. But digging in a little bit into that demonization, would you agree, first of all, that there has been kind of a deliberate characterizing, a way of applying a brand to Islam that serves another purpose, like a more profiteering purpose, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think that if you asked me that a couple of decades ago, I would have said no. The whatever hostility there is towards Islam and Muslims, maybe some of that is deserved, I would even say. And then I would say it's like a diffuse process, and people maybe are not everyone can know everything about everyone in every culture. Like some of that can be definitely excused, and then some of that is like people tend to have certain biases, and there are racists and ethnic supremacists and stuff like that. I would say, and maybe Islamophobia or biases or stereotypes about a Muslim kind of follow that same trajectory. But I think in more recent decades, I actually think that those biases and those stereotypes are very shallow and superficial. And in fact, I think that there are organizations, political organizations, activist and advocacy organizations that thrive on creating stereotypes about Muslims and making them the foreign other and making them completely seem like they're opposed to Western civilizations, they're a threat to Western society, they're a threat to America, that they're going to take over the entire country if they are not suppressed. And that these organizations, purposefully create that narrative in order to create a hated other, in order to serve certain geostrategic and political interests, whether that is the justification of ongoing military engagements in the Middle East, or whether that is supporting what is increasingly becoming a very unpopular policy position, supporting Israel in the Middle East, in order to kind of drive support amongst the people for these adventures that are inevitably going to lead to loss of life and lead to conflict. You have to have an enemy, and you need to create that enemy. And we're going to put in time and money and art marketing and communications and effort in order to manipulate the media, in order to manipulate people, to justify our interests in the Middle East, to justify our policies of blind support for Israel, and in order to give the people a enemy that will force them to look the other way when Congress does what it does, or vote a particular way. This, to me, is, the more that I've paid closer attention to what's going on, seems clear. And in fact, there have been reports done by different institutions that look at what they call the Islamophobia industry. And it's very much an industry. Like, there are billionaires that give hundreds of millions of dollars to different organizations whose entire job is to support speakers, is to support social media, is to support institutions and think tanks, to demonize Muslims and make them seem as the internal enemy to Western civilization for their political needs. So I think that is, so it's very much an artificial and contrived process. And I think that what we're witnessing, and I don't think that I would have ever witnessed this in my lifetime, I could not have predicted it in the past 3-4 years, is the beginning of the collapse of the veil that shielded people from knowing this.
Yes. First, I'm going to echo that 1,000%, and thank God that there's an enlightenment. Like it seems to be like almost a global, well, not as a global, but a Western culture seems to really won't be fooled again, embracing that whole adage. And as I'm looking at this, I'm going to go back and just add a bit of a timeline to what you're saying. Like there was a Cold War era. Like when you look at the map and you consider the two superpowers of the United States and the USSR, and you look at the USSR's power was built on oil. Look at a map and just go draw a line between Russia or Moscow and the Gulf. All the countries who we managed to demonize are in between there. So it was very selective. It seems it was applied in that way, where we're like, okay, we have to pit these people against each other and create friction, and at the very least, we have to create friction between us and them to justify our military position in these countries and the establishment of bases, which we still hold today for many of them. And part of that, one of the saddest collateral damage components of that was the reputation of Islam and the people in that region.
So let me give you I think you bring up a great point, that there is a direct line between perceived geopolitical interests of America, of our government, and the attitudes that they want to create towards Muslims in Islam. So during the Cold War, especially near the end when the Soviet Union was about to collapse and it invaded Afghanistan, we actually were 100% supportive of the jihad, which is a bad term these days, of the mujahideen, a mujahid, or the mujahideen, the Afghan mujahideen. Some of us are old enough to probably recognize this term. A mujahideen is someone who engages in war, jihad, right? And we were 100% supportive of the Afghan jihad against the USSR, and we saw it as a way to weaken the USSR. And in some ways, it was very successful because a few years after the conclusion of that war, the Soviet Union collapsed. So we were pro-jihad. And then when our geopolitical interests required us to control the oil resources in the Middle East, and people were resisting, then all of a sudden we drum up the boogeyman of Muslim fundamentalism and radicalism. And then all of a sudden the same mujahideen that we supported become the Taliban, and they become jihadis and terrorists and oppressors of women. And in a few years, the script has flipped. And then I think that the other main vector that's driving, the concerted effort to demonize Islam and Muslims, we have to recognize is our, full-throated, blind support of Israel and its occupation of Palestinian lands, the West Bank and Gaza, and the fact that created an enormous amount of conflict in that region and pushback and resistance. And, well, we have to demonize those resistors. And how do we do that? Well, one way to do that, to demonize that resistance, is to demonize their religious and faith tradition and demonize those people as completely untrustworthy, as barbarians, as liars, as against Western civilization. Why? So that we can continue to, pursue this policy of blind support to Israel. And I think in the past 3-4 years, even that component is just beginning to crumble.
Yeah, sadly, it still sparks a lot of contention. There are people who come to blows over that conversation still. I mean, we had a presence on campus of a protest that was met with a lot of resistance and a lot of questioning. And I look at these things and this mentality where a conversation should exist, there's just finger pointing and anger. And I look at that as kind of an artifact of those days back when we methodically and deliberately, looked at the demonization of brown people and people who, even though we have so much in common based on our religious, backgrounds, we are more alike than we care to acknowledge, because we've been told we're not. But that I look at that and I say, I wish that anger would just kind of go away. I want to talk about something that I look as a crack in the door, like a little sliver of light of promise, and that was Zoran Mamdani. That we saw near the close of that election, every book being thrown, every page of that old playbook being lit on fire and thrown into that thing, he's a this, and it was very anti-Muslim. It was very, don't trust brown people. They're, whatever. So he clearly won. What are your thoughts about, what does that mean?
Yeah, it was, if you were to do a time travel, go back to the 1990s when I grew up, when I was a teenager, go back to Texas where I grew up, and you were to tell me, hey, Mairaj, in 2025, there's going to be a brown guy that looks just like you, who's a Muslim, and who is not hiding that he's a Muslim, who's going to be the mayor of New York City. And by the way, that's going to happen 24 years after there is a massive terrorist attack that is blamed on Islam and Muslims. I would have been like, well, first of all, I don't believe you that in 25 years there's going to be a Muslim mayor of New York City. And second of all, how could that possibly happen after 9/11 type of terrorist attacks? So sometimes I tell my wife, I'm like, man, what kind of a world are we living in? So it is really, I think that the Mamdani story and the Mamdani campaign gives me a lot of hope, because, and it gives me a lot of hope because I think that it really shows you the incredible capacity of the American people to change, to discover, to consider alternatives, to revise their opinions and biases and stereotypes when confronted with evidence and when confronted with, stories that don't sound right. So it was revealing to me. So that there's that. There's an incredibly positive part about that. And then there is also what I thought was incredibly revealing about certain moments in his campaign, which you kind of brought up, which is about 10 days before the polls started, or maybe after he won the Democratic nomination, right? So he's the Democratic nominee, and if you're the Democratic nominee, in New York City, you're going to win the mayoral race. That's the way that it goes, right? It's a very Democratic city, as most cities are Democrat dominated. But then you see this complete unleashing of, Zoran Mamdani is a Hamas supporter. Zoran Mamdani is going to, impose Sharia law on New York City. Zoran Mamdani is a Muslim communist, which makes really no sense, because a communist technically are supposed to be atheists, and Muslims are hardcore religious people that believe in God. So what does that even mean? Or Zoran Mamdani is, a terrorist sympathizer or whatever. So you just saw the old playbook, but they took that entire playbook, they took the entire trope, they took every single thing imaginable, and they threw it against the guy. And it seemed, first of all, it was weird because there was a sudden explosion of this coordinated communication, marketing, and political communication campaign. This came out of nowhere. You could tell that these individuals were, in secret WhatsApp channels coordinating their steps. It was not organic and natural at all. But then what was really surprising was that it just fundamentally did not work. It did not stick. There were a sufficient number of Americans that are like, we don't buy this narrative anymore. We think that this is complete bunk. We know who our neighbors are. We know what Islam is. And we've been sold stereotypes for certain political ends, and we're not going to let it scare us and scarecrow us and scare us into voting the way that you want to vote. So that to see that process play out over 3-4 weeks in the Mamdani campaign, I think it was something that I could not have predicted, and it's something that gives me a reason, hope, and optimism.
And you had mentioned before that your formative years were post 9/11. You, especially as a Texan, you must have experienced some serious.
Yes. So, I mean, yeah, there were a lot of instances post 9/11. So I was like 24, 25, married. We had a kid. My son was born April 28, 2001. 9/11 happened September 11th, 2001. I can give you some stories. Like, it was post 9/11. My wife and I and our son, who was, I think, a few months old, traveling to Houston to a wedding. My wife's brother was getting married. So we get there. We go to the wedding, and we're in Houston. We were living in LA at that time. We're about to board the flight. We go up to the counter, and the airline employees, sees somebody's flagged, and I think the person that was flagged was my 4 or 5 month old son. His name was flagged for some reason, Ibrahim. They're like, yeah, there's a flag that's showing up for Ibrahim, and my wife was like, Ibrahim is like in his carrier. This is Ibrahim, but it was like she got on the phone, and then all of a sudden I see in the corner of my eye a police officer show up, and then a few more police officers show up behind us, and then Ibrahim, our son, starts crying. So my wife takes him to the restroom to change his diaper. She's followed by 2-3 police officers. It was a really nerve-wracking. We didn't know whether we were going to get on the plane. We were very self-conscious. We didn't, it was in the few months after 9/11. We didn't want to scare the other passengers. We ourselves were scared. So, that was really scary. There were other incidents like that in our life, where we were like, okay, we can definitely tell we're being questioned. And what can you do? You go with it. You don't want to upset a person that has a tremendous amount of police power that can ruin your life in, a millisecond. And I'll tell you another kind of I would say even a sadder story, a sadder set of stories. One, this was probably in 2015. I was here in UC Davis, but on Sundays I would teach Sunday school at the local mosque. Had a great group of kids. These like 13, 14-year-old kids. Many of the kids were like from Fresno, so some of the more rural areas. They commute to Sacramento. And dude, hearing the stories of these students that were in these cities, and they had said, look, man, we're called terrorists on a daily basis. The, young teenage girls, 12, 14, 15 years old, the one that wore hijab, they were getting their hijab pulled off. And it wasn't even by the other students, they weren't being called terrorists by the other students. They were being called terrorists by the teachers. So it was, and for these kids, it was a daily occurrence. And for these kids, it was traumatic. And these kids, they were processing with me. And you could tell they were trying to like laugh it off. But at the same time, man, it was heavy on them. So I think that, like that was 9/11. When 9/11 happened, it was like, I think all the Muslims in America are like, all right, man, this is going to be a boulder that we carry on our shoulders for the rest of our lives. This was done in our religion's name, and there is no escaping from this. How are we going to escape from this? I mean, do we even really want to live in this country? Is this country going to be safe for us? but I think, it's like a remarkable testament to, I think, the fundamental goodness and decency of all human beings, but the fundamental decency and goodness of the American people. Because I could not have predicted that 24 years after 9/11, that our society would be in a position to overcome those stereotypes and to overcome those and recognize them as such, to recognize the hollowness of those narratives, to recognize that they're being used for political purposes. And also now, there are serious questions. Did the government know about 9/11? There are questions about how exactly, what did the government know? Did the government allow it to happen for geopolitical purposes? And these questions are not just happening on the left. They're all now, this I could not have predicted, happening on the right. So there is this incredible moment where we as a people are extremely distrustful of the government, extremely distrustful of our institutions that are supposed to serve us but that are not serving us. And that distrust has also transformed into, let's reconsider the narratives that we have been fed for so long. And to see that process unfold. On the left, I could have seen it. On the right, I could not have seen it. But we as a collective, people that care about this country are all together really, are questioning things. I think a lot of is up for grabs. And I think that, to see that Islam is a part of that story in an intimate way and that it's going in the way that it's going, I couldn't have predicted. But, I'm fully committed to, as an American, as a lover of this country, I'm fully committed to seeing where that goes.
And I have to ask, how's Ibrahim? I mean, he came up he was born into one of the most turbulent times in the United States history. Yeah. Is he okay?
He's okay. He graduated from Oregon State University. He's got a degree in music and computer science. Now he's working as a software engineer. He's a really smart kid. He surprises me sometimes. Let me give you one example of a surprise, and then let me give you one example of a post 9/11 challenge that we had to overcome as a family. The surprise was I came home. He's a really smart kid. He was reading Plato's Republic. I was like, what? Plato's Republic? I could not have predicted that. So that's just this kid, is super smart, but he zigs when I expect him to zag. And I was like, okay, I can see, even though he majored in computer science, I could see that a lot of the humanistic bent, I see that aspect of my personality. His mom's also a big reader, manifests itself in him. So he's doing great, man. But he's kind of suffering the way that all of our younger generation, all of our students are suffering. It's a lot of inflation, tough job market. I really feel for them, and we've got to really serve them better. Let me give you an example of a 9/11 challenge now. So when he was in second grade, we were at Princeton. I was doing my Ph.D. and my wife was working at Princeton, so we lived in Princeton. So it's a very educated city. He was going to public school there. And we went in, and this kid was really smart. As a 3-year-old, this kid made a catalog of all the Hot Wheel cars that he owns. And he was reading by the time he was 3 years old. Super smart kid, really loved learning. And then in second grade, he has this teacher, and just hates school. We go in to teach to talk to his teacher, and he's 6 years old, and she essentially accuses him of being a misogynist. 6-year-old boy. I'm like, what? Why? Where is that coming from? And we were young parents because we had him when, I was 24 when he was born. My wife was 23. Super young parents, living by ourselves. We didn't know what to do with this. And it wasn't until much later on that I was like, oh my God, she's got stereotypes about Islam and about Muslim boys and men being like inherently misogynistic and hating women. And she's projecting that onto our 6-year-old boy. And it was like, it's one of the greatest regrets of my life that I didn't push back, that I didn't challenge her, that I didn't ask to protect my son and ask that he be assigned a different teacher. And I just think that was like a formative negative experience that affected him quite a bit and his attitude towards school. So, it's like that. Another example of like the post 9/11 reality and how it kind of impinged on like the everyday experience of, real life.
And I have to say, to you and your wife's great credit, it is a nonstop effort to overcome that white noise that he must have heard about himself being inferior or being suspect or somehow, not belonging. So congratulations. It sounds like he's really well adjusted now and he's succeeding. He's having, that anyone who reads Plato's Republic for fun.
Yeah, I know. I told him I have not read Plato's Republic I'm a humanities professor, and I told him this is one of the foundational books of Western civilization. He's like, yeah, I know. Yeah. It's like, okay.
But that's a parental mic drop moment right there. And good on you for helping him get past what must have been really challenging. Because kids believe, they hear messages about themselves and they believe it, and they walk away with inferiority complexes or what have you. So job well done. I want to, that is a really wonderful segue into education, because we're hearing a lot now about indoctrination, like higher education in particular being this machine of indoctrination. And it sounds to me, from a few of the examples that you have alluded to, your son's personal experience being labeled as a misogynist, a 6-year-old misogynist, despite the fact, I just want to point out, the snarky part of me can't help but think that teacher's mother couldn't have a credit card probably. I think that's like a 1980s or 70s thing or something like that.
For sure.
Couldn't buy a house without her husband co-signing. Meanwhile, women have been property owners in Islam for whatever. I can't help but honor that irony that's embedded in that whole thing. And I agree. That's the foundation for projecting. Something like, we have been held down. Your son is somebody I could point the finger at. I digress. Getting onto the whole like indoctrination thing, that this, higher education has been called an indoctrination machine, bringing people into wokeness, whatever that even means. To my way, wokeness is enlightenment. I'm not sure that that's ever a bad thing. But the examples that you cited between your son's personal experience, and then you mentioned something earlier about kids that you taught having hijabs pulled off, or being cast as a certain, I don't want to say demonic, but like a lesser quality of citizen or whatever, or somebody to be watched and mindful of. Those are the real products of education left unchecked. What do you think about the accusations that higher education faces now as this indoctrination machine into wokeness?
Yeah. Look, man, I would be happy to indoctrinate. I think I would be a very successful indoctrinator, but the first thing I would need to do is get my students to do the reading. The students, typically see me. I'm one of 4 or 5 teachers. And if teachers and professors really had the power that this indoctrination narrative ascribes to us, then you would think that we would be able to indoctrinate them to do the basic level of duties that they need to as college students, and that is an ongoing struggle. So I think that the indoctrination narrative gives way too much, overemphasizes the amount of power that professors have over the molding of these young minds. The other thing I would say is the vast majority of professors, when I talk to them, when I interact with them, and the value that I set for myself is that we are actually, not charged. Our job is not to create mini-me's. Our job, and we take this job very seriously, is to inculcate the ability to think critically, to analyze at a deep level whatever body of knowledge and set of ideas is placed before you in the particular discipline that you are specializing in. So, and we take, most of us, the vast majority of us, take great pride in being able to present the positions that dominate academic scholarship on any given issue, and and train our students to recognize when there is a disagreement. There are multiple positions on a given contested topic. What are the benefits and drawbacks, strengths and weaknesses of each individual opinion? How do we evaluate them? And which one do we favor? And how do we resolve this disagreement through new research and new data and new findings and new ways of reasoning? Like, I think that, 95% of the faculty that I talk to in the humanities and social sciences, and I think this goes for the STEM people as well, that's what they see as their core value, their core function. They are not out there to create, these ideological monsters that are progressive and liberal, and that's not what they see as their job. That's not what I see. In fact, I try to be hyper aware, and most of my colleagues are hyper aware of what are my internal political convictions, what are my intellectual convictions, what are my cultural convictions. And as a professor and a researcher and experter in the field of X, Y, Z, what does the field represent as the truth? As not the truth in the capital T sense of word, but the truth in terms of here's what researchers and academics believe is most likely the case given the evidence available to right now. And then, but also present in that particular discipline. Here are the particular contested issues within the field. Like, for instance, my research is on this one scriptural source in Islam called the hadith, right? And the hadith were collected, and the hadith are basically sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, essentially. There are hundreds of thousands of them. They're collected in many different books, and they were collected over a period of like about a century to 2 centuries after his death, right? So there was a lag time between his death and between when they were finally written down. So there is an enormous amount of debate. Can we trust these? Do they actually go back to the Prophet Muhammad? How do we sift the good from the bad? How skeptical do we need to be? And my job as a professor of Islamic studies, when I teach my Introduction to Islam unit, and when I teach the hadith, is not to tell them one way or the other, this is what the right answer is, believing about the hadith. Why? Because the field has not settled on a right answer. Here is approach one. It is super skeptical. It doubts that there is any reliable way to ascribe these to Muhammad. Here is the approach of the people that think, no, we have a reliable way of ascribing to Muhammad, and and most of them are probably authentic. And then there's a middle ground. What are the relative strengths and weaknesses of each of these approaches? And that is the state of the field. This is my job. When I teach hadith, this is what I'm doing. And now, as an expert, I have an instinct of what I think is most probably the right, but I don't present that as the only way. I present, here's the ways that other scholars, the field is approaching the issue. So I think that the vast majority of scholars, of researchers, of professors, because they're, in some senses, they're like just super nerds, right? And they just get into the weeds, and they want to present the specialized knowledge of their field. And I don't think that they are in it to create a certain type of citizen, or to make someone conservative or someone liberal or progressive or whatever. So I think that is an overblown narrative. It might have some aspects that are true to it, but I think the way that it's found in many aspects of our culture of our culture right now, it's not true.
And you've even taken this a step farther to illustrate your philosophy here. Did you not just co-create a curriculum that? Because I mean, the recent, flare up about the Gaza, the Palestinians and Israel, led to a lot of contentious. Like, people didn't feel like it was safe to talk about anything, and there was a lot of back and forth. And you kind of co-authored a curriculum or a way of talking about this or teaching.
Yeah. So a couple of months after October 7th, 2023. I'm the director of the Middle East South Asia Studies program, and I was like, okay, I think that I knew that this was going to be not an easy conflict, and I knew that it was not going to go away soon, and I knew that it's going to create a lot of passions, and I think the core value of the university is as a staging ground for people to explore and find and figure out what is the truth, especially on issues that inflame passions, on which there is a lot of interest and a lot of heat. So how do we take something that is attracting a lot of interest, but also a lot of heated passion and emotion, and how do we continue to examine it and reason about it and converse and discourse about it and discuss it in a rational way? And so that's the place of the university. That's supposed to be the place. That's where it's supposed to take place. Reason, discourse. So I reached out to my colleague, the director of Jewish Studies, Sven Eric Rose. We ended up becoming very good friends. And I was like, you know what? This is this is what I think the mission of the university is. Let's, collaborate on something like a class. Let's not just teach anti-Semitism. Let's teach both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together. Why? Because they are, and let's explore to see what are their similarities and what are their differences, and why do they exist, and where do they get their power from? What is their history? And so we developed this curriculum, this 2-credit class that we offered as a humanities course, and got a lot of students taking it. And I'm not an expert on Islamophobia. Maybe I'll devote one class to it in my introduction to Islam class, but that's not my area of research. And Professor Rose is not an expert in anti-Semitism. He is an expert in German Jewish thought in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, which is not the same thing as anti-Semitism. But, as a director of Jewish studies, as a scholar of Jewish studies, he knows something about it. So we were both like, you know what, let's co-create this curriculum for this class, the syllabus for this class. And in the process, we will end up learning ourselves. What is the literature on Islamophobia? What is the literature on anti-Semitism? And how are they kind of related, intertwined? How are they different? Are the same types of social pressures? Do they create the same types of things? And we did this, we ran this class last fall. And it was both a exhilarating experience, and it was also a very stressful experience. It was really interesting, and a thing of beauty to see the level of detail and depth and commitment that Professor Rose had to explaining the history behind behind anti-Semitism in 19th century Europe. So it was great.
I have to ask, what was the nature of the stress? You said it's stressful.
I think that the nature of the stress was, well, anytime you teach a brand new class is very stressful. Why? Like if I was to teach a new class by myself, like I'm, gathering these reading materials for the first time. I don't know whether they're going to work or not. I don't know what is going to be the attitude of the students. So look, that's stressful enough. I had never co-taught a class before, so now we're doing this super stressful thing for the first time, but now we're doing it as a team, right? And then, to day in and day out, as the Gaza war is going on, as the Israel-Palestine conflict is unfolding, as there are worldwide campus encampments and protests on this issue, to go in week in and week out and try to discuss the history of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in that kind of a pressured environment. It's just, it was a pressure cooker environment, and I'm glad that we did it. And I ended up learning an insane amount, both about Islamophobia and definitely about anti-Semitism. And I'm glad that we did it.
I remember those days, and I like I'm saying that like it was like a decade ago, but I remember the vibe around those days. People were looking for conflict. People media was camped out here, waiting for someone to throw a punch or something like that. So I could definitely imagine that level of stress added to what you were going through from just the logistics of teaching a class. I have to ask, closing thoughts. It seems like progress is being made, and it seems like you are contributing to the progress. When I say progress, I mean increased awareness, increased understanding, increased appreciation for new knowledge, or new knowledge of old information, like that becoming awareness. Are you hopeful, and how do you imagine we all act in a way that continues any hope? What can we do?
So I think that I am definitely hopeful. I think I'm an optimist at heart, and I always think that human beings are fundamentally decent and fundamentally good. I talked about the challenging experiences as a Muslim post 9/11 and pre 9/11 as well, but the overwhelming experience of being a Muslim American in this country in the past 30 years has been, for me personally, overwhelmingly positive. I wouldn't be who I am, my personality, my character, had it not been for the country that I belong to and the culture that formed me. And the culture in Texas, Allen, Texas, where I grew up. And the vast majority of my experience was one of kindness, openness, curiosity, of collaboration. And so I think that we as Americans have this indomitable spirit and curiosity. We are willing to invent. We're willing to try new things out, new ideas, new identities, new values. Some people might think that makes us, kind of fad chasing and trendy, but whatever. So I have an incredible amount of optimism because I love our people. And by our people, I'm talking about us as a nation, as a country. And I also think we're living in a very interesting time, a very interesting geopolitical time, where it seems like, for the past couple of decades, we as a country were the top dog in the world, a unipolar world is what they call it, right? But now we're entering into a multipolar world, and that's going to be disconcerting to a lot of people. I think we're also, have just experienced a time period where there's been an incredible consolidation of wealth in the hands of a few, and that is beginning to show negative consequences of that. Interesting thing is, wealth concentration and inequality has traditionally been a very left-wing issue, but it is no longer a left-wing issue. It is now a right-wing issue as well. So in some senses, we as a country seem to be deeply divided and fighting, and you can't really talk to a Democrat without them hating on Republicans and vice versa. But then when you take a little step back and you look at some of the convergence, there's a convergence. Like, I think both the right and the left are like, I think big tech has too much monopoly over power. They're too powerful. They control too much of our lives. I'm not sure. There seems to be a concentration of wealth and power in Wall Street. Or why is it that we are giving so much money to foreign countries when we have a homelessness problem? That does not seem like it's the right thing to do. We need to take care of ourselves first. Or even the collapse of, Islamophobic tropes, and they're no longer effective. Or even the massive shift on Israel-Palestine issue. Americans are waking up, both on the right and the left, and they're questioning, is this the right policy? Is this the right foreign policy? So it's unnerving when you have the amount of change that we're seeing. We also don't know how it's going to turn out. I'm scared for my children. Like, one of the challenges is when I graduated from college, I graduated actually as a business major. I was a management information systems. I worked as a data network engineer. My starting salary was something like $65,000 in 1998. My son, 30 years later, living in California, expensive state, with the inflation of 30 years, had just a little bit, got as an opening job as a computer scientist, got just a little bit more than that. So I'm like, what's going on here? That doesn't sound right. My $65,000 in Texas in 1998 is not equal to the $72,000 or $75,000 in California in 2024. There's something seriously wrong about that. How can we as a society continue moving forward if our young people are not able to find solid starter jobs with good salaries in which they can live decent lives and in which they can move up the ranks? So I think that there's our geopolitical change, there's our internal economic structure does not seem like it's working. Higher education, as we all know, is under attack. So simultaneously, it's a very stressful time period. We don't know how it's going to end up, but simultaneously, I think largely because of social media and its decentralized nature, where everyone's got a camera and everyone can have their own YouTube channel, there is no longer a monopoly and control over the narratives that dominate our society. So you're starting to see that unravel. So I think that we are living in this very interesting moment in time where we're going to probably in 10 years, we're going to be living in very different, potentially, societies. But I'm hopeful because I believe in our people. And I'm also hopeful because I get to see our young people on a daily basis. And the young people they're sharp. They're kind. They will work hard, and they are going to have to really kind of rise to the occasion, and I think they will. So that's where I'm at.
Agreed, and thank you for that. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for coming back, and I hope we can have you back again, and we can talk about uplifting things.
Yes, definitely. I would love to be back here.
All right, outstanding. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Mairaj Syed. If you'd like to learn more about Mairaj and his work, check out our YouTube page for links to his bios, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say, and we guarantee something for everyone. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Y Pavilion. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.